floor is yours, Ned. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Thomas. That was a very generous introduction. Let me just mention, so first of all, I've put the link to the chapter in the chat. Yeah, that's a Dropbox link. Anybody can download it. And one thing is the book is not actually out yet because I haven't finished the proofs. I haven't finished correcting the proofs, but I did correct the proofs on this chapter. A second thing is I'm happy to have questions at any time. So, don't feel you have to wait till the end. Oh, and let's see, an additional thing is, how long do I have actually?
So it really depends on what you prepared. Usually what we ask is around 40 minutes so that we can have plenty of time for questions. But if you have more, this is also perfectly fine. So just tell us what you have prepared.
Okay, so I will cut some things out.
You don't have to. You don't have to. Do whatever you prefer.
Okay. Yeah. Well. All right. So. Yeah. So. Well. I'll just do it, and we'll see where we are. Okay. So this is an empirical argument that perception is non-conceptual. I just want to say a little bit about why it's important. One reason that I think is maybe appeals more to scientists than philosophers. What? I beg your pardon? I heard somebody say something, but I don't know who that is.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I think people really have to turn off their microphones. So that was not, I think, a question intended for you, Ned.
Okay.
So please, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to do that for everyone. Okay, sorry about this.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so one is just the architecture of the mind. So if perception is conceptual, then maybe there isn't such a big difference between cognition and perception. If it's non-conceptual and if cognition is conceptual, well, then that is a major difference. A second point is in epistemology, the kind of standard view of the justification of perceptual belief is that we just endorse our perceptions. We believe what we see. But if perception is non-conceptual, we need a different model because to believe what we see, the standard model of that is a perception has a propositional conceptual content. And we just change the mode from seeing to believing. But I'm going to argue that can't be the right story because perception doesn't have propositional and conceptual content. A third thing that's kind of relevant to sort of kind of the future is if we develop robots where the cameras feed directly into cognition, according to what I'm saying, those robots would not be seeing. I mean, we may talk as if they're seeing, but they wouldn't actually be seeing. Okay, so I'm using the word concept in a particular way. So this is just a verbal point, but I just want to say what I mean by the word concept. So the word concept, as I'm using it, is a way of thinking of something. A concept of X is a way of thinking of X. So famously, Oedipus had two different concepts of Jocasta, mom, which we might put in terms of mom and wife. The way of thinking is, by that I mean cognition broadly construed, including evaluation, decision, expectation, reasoning, problem solving, and working memory. So a perceptual concept involves a perceptual way of thinking. So for example, if I'm looking at the top of a cup, and also feeling it, I can have both a tactile and a visual concept of the cup. So importantly, the idea is that concepts involve actual or potential cognition, including, especially, I will be mentioning the formulation of expectations. I'm not requiring that concepts involve some kind of sentential thinking. So non-linguistic creatures can certainly have expectations. Just to be clear about that. So let's. Oops. Sorry about that. So just to make ideas clear, the solitary wasp is a candidate for non-conceptual and non-cognitive perception. It's just a candidate. We don't, really know for sure, but there's evidence that wasps have very little in the way of cognition, and probably very little in the way of consciousness too. So they may be a case of pure perception. So I'm drawing on the work of Peter Godfrey Smith, who has argued that the solitary, well, I'm not talking about social wasps, I'm talking about solitary wasps. Social wasps are more cognitively sophisticated. They have excellent vision. The adult phase is under enormous evolutionary pressure to minimize brain size for flight. They have a short lifespan, so little use for learning. And probably most importantly, they have not been shown to be capable of instrumental or Skinnerian conditioning, although they are capable of Pavlovian conditioning. They famously have these stereotyped action patterns, and the consciousness stuff is really about the fact that they don't do wound tending. If you chop off a leg, they appear not to even notice. They just carry on as best they can without that leg or without the wing or whatever you chopped off. A wasp is a candidate for non-conceptual and non-cognitive perception. In philosophy, we have a distinction between non-conceptual content. The content of a thought, if you think that 2 + 2 = 4, that 2 + 2 = 4 is the content of your thought. We also have an idea of a state, a non-conceptual state. That's non-conceptual if the subject of the state need not have the concepts required to characterize the state's content from the subject's point of view. And wasps may be such a case. They have vision, but there is some reason to think that they have no propositional thought and no concepts. The weakness of the wasp example is that we don't have any really strong evidence that they don't have concepts. And some people may wish to say that they don't have percepts either. So I like the example, and this is the example I'm going to be using throughout the talk, of 4 infants. Oh, I've got the wrong dates in there. From infants from 6 months to 11 months old. They have color percepts without color concepts. So I'm going to be talking about 3 kinds of representations of color. There's color category representations, which come in at 4 to 6 months. There's color concepts that start coming in at 11 to 12 months. And then there are linguistic color concepts that come in at around 3 years. So it's this age that is a really good illustration of color perception without an employment of color concepts. So here's a little summary of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with infant categorical perception. I'll then move to the color concepts, then color language, then I'll contrast all 3 of these, color categories, concepts, and linguistic concepts. And then the last stage, I'll argue that adult color perception is non-conceptual too. Okay, so first of all, categorical perception. As everybody knows, the rainbow is a continuous band of wavelengths, but we see it as divided into stripes. That's categorical perception. The behavioral index is you're faster and more accurate in discriminating between categories than within categories. So all these experiments on children below 1 year old use nonverbal techniques that also can be used on animals. And most of the work on the early childhood I'm going to talk about is due to Anna Franklin, who's a developmental psychologist at Sussex. So the idea is this: if you show a baby or an adult a screen of one color with a disc of a different color, we all will tend to move our eyes to the disc. And here's the thing: we're quicker, that is, if we see the disc as a different color. So you can use this technique to gauge whether people see the disc as a different color, but they move faster. They move their eyes faster if the background and the disc are different color categories. A second technique for measuring people's color categories is this looking time method. This is the beginning, the very first device that was used to do this. This is Robert Fantz looking into a machine with a ground glass screen. And I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the infant down here? Is that visible? And so he can see the infant's, where the infant is looking. And the most straightforward result is infants. So the orange is how long the infant spends looking at this thing. So they like looking at faces. They don't like looking at blank screens very much, so they don't look much. So infants will look at things that interest them. This is the modern technique. So the particular version of it that Anna Franklin uses is this rather nice version involving something called habituation. So the infant is seated in front of a double screen. And if you show the infant the same color on the left and the right again and again and again, the infant starts to lose interest. But then if you have a different color on one side, the infant is likely to look to that side if he sees it as a different color, and will look longer if it's a different color category. It's called novelty preference, and it can be used to gauge infant color categories. And here is a diagram. It's a two-dimensional diagram of a three-dimensional color space, so it isn't as good as you might want. But here are infants all over the world have these 5 color categories: reddish, orangish, greenish, bluish, and purplish. The way to read the diagram is that if there's no line between boxes, then this side and this side are different color categories. If there is a line, then they're part of the same color category. So the gaps, where you see gaps, are the borders between infant color categories. And you know, you can Franklin has compared infant color categories with many different language categories, and you know, they correspond more or less. And she has a very good neural explanation for why they have the color categories. But in any case, infants do have these color categories. So to summarize, 6 to 11-month-old infants have nearly adult levels of color discrimination. They move their eyes to what they see as a different color. They're bored by the same color and they look to the side with a new color. And then there's a neural effect called the oddball effect, which I won't go into, but they all map onto the same color categories. So here is the argument I'm about to make. 6 to 11-month-old infants exhibit the abilities that are at least somewhat indicative of deployment of concepts of shape, size, and kind, but not color. So there's a contrast between their concepts, or really probably better proto-concepts of shape, size, and kind, and their concepts of color. And that's what I'm about to go into. So remember, it's this age that I'm talking about. Any questions so far? Okay, so here's the first experiment that suggests that they don't notice color. This is uses something called the tunnel effect. If you have a green ball sliding to a barrier that is only just the width of the green ball, and then a red ball comes out, adults will see a absolutely compelling impression of continuous and uniform movement behind the screen. And we will see that as a green ball turning into a red ball. And that will attract the attention of an adult. But Teresa Wilcox found that 4.5-month-olds show increased looking time if a ball turns into a box, but not if a red ball turns into a green ball. At 7.5 months, they could use shape and kind information, but they still don't look longer if a red ball turns into a green ball. It takes to 11.5 months before they notice color enough to look longer when a red ball turns into a green ball. And so the idea here, this is evidence that 6 to 11-month-olds do not normally notice color. Normally, they see colors as shown by their discrimination, but they don't notice colors. Now, an objection might come up, and it's the reason why I've put the word normally in there. The objection is maybe they can have a concept or perhaps a proto-concept of color with training, and that is in fact right. Wilcox also showed that if you train them so that one color is used for one purpose and another color is used for another purpose, then with 2 rounds of training, 9.5-month-olds did look longer at the red ball changing to the green ball. And it took more training for 7.5-month-olds to look longer. And she hasn't looked younger. So the training is, just to focus in on the training here, the training is pounding something with a green cup versus pouring with a red cup. And what she found was that training at 9.5 months transferred from one color to another. Before that, it didn't transfer. So it seems like after about 9 months, they have more of an ability to notice color with training. But the important point here is the fact that training can lead them to notice color doesn't show that before training they notice color, or that they have concepts or proto-concepts of color as a temporary property of things. And the same is true for after training. I don't think they, even after training, I'm going to argue that they do not have color, conceptual color perception. So here is the logic of the situation. They normally have no concept or proto-concept of color. So they normally don't have conceptual color perception. Now, it is true that they can have at least the proto-concept of color. And so we could conclude that either they can have proto-conceptual color perception, or that they have proto-conceptual color cognition with non-conceptual or non-proto-conceptual color perception. So I'm going to argue that it's that they have, with training, they can get some semblance of cognition. But this discussion may raise the issue of maybe they have a concept of color as a temporary property of things. So my reply to that is I have 2 items of experimental evidence. First of all, if you show 6 to 8-month-olds pictures of things that are normal colored and abnormally colored, when things have a stereotypical color like faces and fruits and vegetables, they prefer to look at the normal color ones. But as far as flowers go, they don't care. That's item 1. Item 1, they actually have a preference for normal color, suggesting that whatever color abilities they have are not concepts of color or proto-concepts as a temporary property. But there's a much more significant experimental finding. This is from Jean-Remy Hochmann. And what he did was he looked at, he presented infants with something on the left and something on the right, and same shape, like two discs or 2 triangles, predicted something that children find very interesting, a jumping frog that makes a wonderful noise, but only on one side. So the kids could learn the rule, same shape predicts frog on the left or frog on the right. but they were just beginning to learn the rule same color at 12 months. So the idea here is before 12 months, they do not use color, even temporary color, to formulate expectations. Now, I consider this to be a better experiment from the point of view of capturing cognition, because this experiment requires working memory. So I'm going to say a little bit about the reason it requires working memory is because they have to hold the past instances in mind of same shape predicting something. So what is working memory? Here is, oh, sorry, I was going to say something about what working memory is, but I'll get to that in a second. So here's another experiment that shows working memory. So this is Tremblay, Leslie, and Hall 2000. You have a screen, an object comes out and goes back. Another object comes out and goes back. And then the screen goes up and you can see the two objects. So that's the control. But you can also have a surprising case where an object comes out and goes back, another one, but then you don't see those two objects. You see two objects of the same kind. So before 12 months, they're surprised at a change in shape, but not color. This can be red and this can be green, and they're not surprised when they see two red things. A similar so this shows failure of coding color in working memory and using it to formulate expectations, because you've got to hold the thing in working memory in order to formulate the expectations, just as with the Hochmann experiment. This is a different kind of experiment, but of the same general sort. This uses shape and kind and color information in forming expectations about number. So if this is key to number, the previous one was not key to number. But they have some kind of similar feel to them. You have a screen, an object comes out and goes back, another object comes out and goes back. And then the question is, do they expect two things or one thing? And the general result is they use shape and kind information many months earlier than they use color. So here's a little video, homemade thing. So under 12 months, they don't expect two things. So we have these three different paradigms that strongly suggest that they don't use color when they do in forming expectations, and they in circumstances in which they do use shape and kind. And these all involve working memory. So the upshot is normally they don't code color in working memory representation, and that is indicative of their lacking color concepts. So I am running short, so I'm going to skip a little bit about working memory, but I will say something about working memory. No, I think I'm going to skip all the working memory stuff. I'm sorry, I don't just, I'm low on time. So you might wonder, why don't these paradigms show that they do notice color? So, this is a verbal point. I'm using a sense of the word notice that involves cognitive categorization of the sort required for formulating expectations in these kinds of paradigms. So that's what I just mean by notice. So you may wonder, doesn't this paradigm show that they do have expectations regarding color? So the point I want to make is this is just preferential looking, as with these other paradigms that I showed. I mean, you could call it expectations, but they're not. The main point is that these things are not cognitive. Now, you might wonder, so here's an objection. You, namely I'm using special senses of the word concept, expectation, notice, and other terms. With so many made up concepts, why should we take your claims to be relevant to anything we care about? And I do understand that I am using very specific senses of these terms, But to put it in a jargon-free, relatively jargon-free way, the point is that there's a perceptual system, there's a cognitive system. Color representations in the perceptual system do not get into the cognitive system until 11 to 12 months of age. So between 6 months and 11 months, they have color vision without color cognition. And so that's really the point. It's independent of the special senses of some of these terms. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't turn off my phone. One objection is you may think that the infant's color constancy is too poor to support expectations of color, but we have very good reason to deny that, namely that the training events give them good enough constancy to be surprised when a green ball turns into a red ball. So their constancy is good enough. Okay, the next step is color language. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I have one. Oh, go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah, just a question of definition. I'm not sure how do you define cognition?
So cognition, I'm defining. Remember, at the very beginning, I said that what I'm thinking of is cognition broadly construed. So concepts are ways of thinking, and thinking is cognition broadly construed, including evaluation, decision, expectation, reasoning, problem solving, working memory. So it's a constellation. If you're familiar with the global workspace, I'm defining cognition as all the consuming systems whose neural basis is prefrontal cortex, and that are used for all these capacities like evaluation, decision, reporting, etc.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question, which is, I hope not something that would anticipate on what you want to say, but I was a little bit surprised that you insist so much on what's going on before 12 months and after 12 months, because you told us that even in adults, your claim was that color perception is non-conceptual. So what is exactly the switch at, from 11 to 12 if it's not exactly that? So am I confused here?
No, so this is my fault. I haven't carefully stated it. So my point is, before 12 months, infants have color perception and they don't even have concepts of color. After 12 months, they do have concepts of color. And I am going to argue that even though they have concepts of color, they don't have conceptual color perception. Their color perception remains non-conceptual. But my strongest case is for this period between 6 and 12 months. That they can't have color, conceptual color perception because they don't even have the damn concepts. Afterwards, they do have the concepts, and I have evidence, but it's not as strong as the evidence from about the 6 to 12 months.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so now I'm going to say something about color language. Okay, so we've been talking about this 6 to 12 months. They don't get color language until they're 3. And even at 3, many children don't know the 4 basic color words. So in 1980, Mabel Rice did a teaching experiment. A group of 2 to 3-year-olds who knew no color words were taught the difference between red and green. For most children, this took over 1,000 trials over several weeks. Charles Darwin said the following: "I attended carefully to the mental development of my young children, and with 2, or as I believe 3 of them, soon after they had come to the age when they knew the names of all common objects, I was startled by observing that they seemed quite incapable of affixing the right names to the colors in colored engravings, though I tried repeatedly to teach them. I distinctly remember declaring that they were color blind." And many parents have had this experience. There was a term for it in the early 20th century called farbendomite. Recently, there's evidence that color language comes in earlier than it did in 1980. And, you know, maybe it has something to do with all these colored plastic things. And parents do spend a lot of time talking to kids about color now. So here's an interesting thing. In 1980, children did not get the 4 basic color terms until they were an average of 3 years, 3 months. However, Binet's early IQ tests given in France and other European countries showed that in France at that time, children did not get the 4 basic color words until age 7. So there has been a huge increase in their exposure to color, and they're getting color language. But it does show you something about just what it takes to get them the color language. Okay, now, because I'm really running short of time, I'll say a little more about this stuff, but maybe I'm going to skip all this and move directly to adult color perception.
Don't worry, really. I mean, you can take your time.
Yeah, well, no. I want there to be plenty of time.
Okay.
So, for the philosophers, I just want to point out that the left visual, this is a horizontal slice through the brain. The left visual field feeds to the right side of both retinas and feeds to the right hemisphere. So you need to know that in order to understand the experiments I'm about to mention. So here is a diagram of categorical perception in infants as compared with adults. So this is within category discrimination. This is time. The experiment here is you have the uniform screen of one color with a disc of a different color. So this is how long it takes to move your eyes to the disc of a different color. So the signature of categorical perception is, it takes longer within categories than between categories. So colors that are equally separated in terms of wavelength, it takes longer to move your eyes for 2 shades of red than between red and green. Okay, so for infants, you only see this is the signature of categorical perception. Sorry, did I explain that properly? Does everybody understand that? You only see it in the left visual field, i.e. the right hemisphere. But with adults, you see it in both hemispheres. And that leads to the possibility that adults, with the introduction of left hemisphere language, have conceptual color perception dominated by the left hemisphere. And so this gives rise to 3 different replacement possibilities. One is that categorical perception in infants is replaced by conceptual perception. Non-conceptual categorical perception is replaced with conceptual perception. Another possibility that I like better is that we have non-conceptual categorical perception is retained but modified by top-down influence by the different language categories in your language. And then a third possibility is that adults have both non-conceptual and conceptual color perception. Okay, everybody clear on the 3 possibilities here? Okay, I'm going to give experimental evidence for this one, which is that adults only have non-conceptual color perception. Okay, so this is an experiment done by an Oxford group. And so the idea is they showed subjects a grid on the left and a grid on the right that could be different colors taken from this color wheel. And the grids could have different orientations. And you needn't worry about what happens here. This is a task designed to make sure that they that attention is directed to both color and orientation, but we don't need to worry about what this is. And in the 300 milliseconds that the thing was on the screen, they looked at what was going on in the brain using the, these EEG hats and looked where in the head they could decode color perception. And here's what they found. They found that overwhelmingly, color perception was decoded from the hemisphere in the back of the head on the opposite side, that is what they call contralateral, from the stimulus. Left stimulus, right hemisphere, right stimulus, left hemisphere. The important thing here is that this did not reflect conceptual or verbal categories. So these are the language areas of the brain. This is Wernicke's area right here in the upper part of the temporal lobe. This is Broca's area. And for those of you who aren't used to this, these are ears, this is the nose. And these areas are pretty dark. They're just not getting decoding there. So the upshot is that, as they put it, activity in posterior electrodes, contralateral, that's on the opposite side from the stimulus, were the primary contributors to the decoding of both features over the whole brain. They looked everywhere in the brain, suggesting that visual sensory processing was the main source of decodable signals, ruling out alternative explanations of color decoding, such as verbal labeling. It's also very significant that this was the decoding was very fast, between 150 and 350 milliseconds. Those of you familiar with the global workspace know that it takes 300 milliseconds or more for the global workspace to be activated, to start being activated. It's really 270 to 500 milliseconds. So this suggests very little global workspace activation for color perception, or at least much better decoding in the back of the head. So that is one item of information, item of evidence that adult color perception is also non-conceptual. A second item of evidence is color agnosia. So the most interesting cases of color agnosia are cases with normal color perception and color categorization, but little or no ability to note when objects are colored with their characteristic colors. So the data I'm going to show you comes from a French study. It's a stroke patient. The lead author, I can't pronounce her name very well, but I think it's Ciuda Krizwicka, Witzel, Chobani, et al. And what they did was they presented the same stimuli with two different questions. One question is, are the colors from the same category? And these are from the same category and these aren't. And then there's name comprehension. Where is brown? And that's this one. So different answers for different questions. And the main finding is that categorization did not predict naming and naming did not predict categorization, suggesting that categorical perception and color naming are separate processes. It's a classic double dissociation. So as they say, the result challenges the hypothesis that adult color categorization and color naming depend on the same set of neural processes. I have a few other items, but I'm gonna skip them. So this suggests preservation of non-conceptual color categories, possibly modified by top-down influence. So I am going to go to another. I'll just mention one item of data. So as I'm sure everybody's familiar, different languages cut up the colors differently. I've showed a slide that showed some evidence of that. And one case that's been studied a lot is Greek and Russian, which have separate words for light blue and dark blue, whereas many other languages just have the same word for both. And you might think, if you do if you have a sample and then the subjects have to say which of these is the same color, that they might be faster for light blue and dark blue if they're Russian speakers or Greek speakers, and that is in fact borne out. And in a famous review by Regier and Kay, here's what they say. Does language affect perception? As noted above, several studies suggest that the answer is yes, at least in connection with color. These studies have shown that there is categorical perception for color, and that differences in color category boundaries between languages predict I'm sorry, I tried to shut off my phone. Predict where color CP will occur. Moreover, several of these studies and others have shown that color CP disappears with a concurrent verbal interference task, confirming that color CP is language-based. So this is one of these cases that I love reading in an article where the evidence that they take to support their view actually contradicts it. Okay, the fact that color categorical perception disappears with a concurrent verbal task shows that the behavioral results they're seeing are not due to color categorical perception, because they're due to some kind of an interaction between cognition and perception. And this point is actually noted in another paper about Russian speakers, and what they say is, if the language-specific distortions in perceptual discrimination had been a product of a permanent change in perceptual processors, temporarily disabling access to linguistic representations with verbal interference should not have changed the pattern in perceptual performance. Instead, our results suggest that language-specific distortions in perceptual performance arise as a function of the interaction of lower-level perceptual processing and higher-level knowledge systems like language in the process of arriving at perceptual decisions. In other words, these effects are post-perceptual. So just to summarize, 6 to 11-month-old infants normally have color perception without color concepts. There's some evidence that adult color perception does not involve an extra conceptual representation. Of course, none of this shows that high-level perception or object perception are non-conceptual, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ned. Okay. We have plenty of time for questions. Thank you so much, Ned, for sort of accelerating in such a way, and you were nonetheless extremely clear. So really, thank you for that. I see that Jan-Peter Kranzman has a question, but before that, just one clarification question. Can you define a little bit in more detail top-down influence? You said that that your hypothesis was that there was top-down influence, but you didn't say in detail what counts as a top-down influence.
Yeah, so there are plenty of experiments that show that you can get categorical perception of arbitrary things. So one very nice experiment shows orientation perception, where you take an arbitrary orientation and then you call one side of it A and the other side B, and you can train people up so that they treat that as that is a category, and they have categorical perception for orientation with that as an arbitrarily chosen color orientation boundary. So whether to call that top down, I don't know, but it certainly is introduced by training. It's an acquired piece of categorical perception. And so that's why it makes sense to raise the question of whether the experience we have as adults with our language-specific color categories changes our perception. But it looks like it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Jan Peter.
He's like, but you don't.
I suggest Jonathan goes first because I have some background knowledge. So
sorry.
Okay, so Jonathan first.
Okay. I think, yeah, I was still just making sure I had the right formulation in my mind. I think I got it. So thank you very much for this talk. So I had, I guess, two questions. So the first one is that, so with some of the master students just before this, we were reading your article about the no report paradigm and kind of what's wrong with it. So one of the first kind of questions I had was whether this evidence that you're describing for this non-conceptual color perception, whether it's getting at a similar sort of issue that was going on in that paper looking at kind of binocular rivalry, and whether or not there's kind of the evidence that we have or the different experiments that can be designed to disentangle sensory perception from cognitive perception.
So these are all aimed at the same basic idea. That we can have, well, that was the focus on consciousness there, but right. This talk, I'm not focusing on consciousness, but it's the same basic idea that we have a lot of perceptual processes that surprisingly seem uncontaminated by cognition. So it really does support a boundary between perception, conscious and unconscious perception on one side, and cognition on the other side.
Okay, and maybe just a quick follow-up is that on that then, so you also provided, in this talk, you were providing this sort of evidence about kind of whether or not certain language areas of the brains were lit up at the same time with these kind of color perceptions. And I wondered, so in that article, I guess just because it's also fresh in my mind in the no report article, there's also this sort of objection that, well, maybe we, instead of using fMRIs, we need kind of more fine-grained studies to be able to detect whether these other areas of the brain are being, are working, but just in a more subtle way. Would there be a similar sort of issue here?
Well, that's an interesting point. So the difficulties we find in trying to find the neural basis of consciousness in adults are that we always require reports. And, one way or another, even the no report paradigm requires reports to calibrate the technique, like eye movements, or reports to that come later after the experiment, after the online phase. There's reports in there somewhere, and then you always have the problem of disentangling the effect of reports from the cognitive process underlying reports from the conscious or perceptual processes themselves. However, in these experiments, we don't have that problem because there's no reports. These are, especially the ones with babies, these are completely nonverbal. There's no reporting. There's just spontaneous behavior on the part of the infants. So we get, in a way, a purer account. I should say that we're developing lots of new techniques to try to deal with that problem. And I am an author on a paper in the Journal of Neuroscience that came out last year that, the way this came about was I was teaching a graduate course in the philosophy department, and there was a student in the class who was a grad student in psychology, Omri Racah, R-A-C-C-A-H, and he had worked in Joseph Parvizi's lab doing these brain stimulation experiments. And what we realized in talking about it, that it supplied actually strong evidence against prefrontal activity being significant in conscious perception. And the idea was this, that all that Parvizi's lab is doing, you know, he's a doctor and they have all these epilepsy patients. And, you know, they have to map out the brain to see what where various capacities are centered, so they know not to hurt those parts. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. So Parvizi has done a lot of brain stimulation all over the brain. And here's what we realized. If you think about the theories of consciousness that are based in prefrontal activity, like the global workspace theory or the higher order thought approach. So for those who aren't familiar with this, the higher order thought approach says that what it is to have a conscious perception of red is to have a first order in the visual system representation of red, but also a prefrontal cortex pointer to it. That's Hak-Lin-Lau's version. But if that's true, if you have to have some kind of prefrontal cortex thought pointer to the perception of red, then if you stimulate prefrontal cortex, that ought to affect ongoing perception. That is, if the patient is looking at the doctor's face and you buzz the prefrontal cortex, you ought to get some kind of perturbation at some point in the prefrontal cortex. You ought to, like if you hit if you happen to hit the circuit that's doing the pointer, it should make it point to something else, or increase the intensity of the pointing, or decrease it, or something, by way of affecting the perception. And what Omri did a review of the literature. There's no reports of PFC stimulation affecting ongoing perception. It doesn't appear to exist. And nothing, all the Parvizi lab stuff, there's no report nobody in the Parvizi lab has observed this. So that's evidence against the cognitive theories of consciousness.
Thank you very much.
So next in line is Jan-Peter Konsman.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you very much for that great presentation. I mean, Thomas introduced you as being a good example of a philosopher in science. I think that during your talk, you showed that you can use science to inform philosophy of mind, at least.
I know, that's why I said sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, we have another interference, I think. So my question was actually, to what extent you think that what you described can be transposed to other modalities. So I get that you are interested mostly in vision, but I was thinking of, like, does this transpose to other external senses and even like internal senses? Because like visceral perception is a very different kind of perception, and often it's more tightly linked to emotions rather than cognition. Do you have some ideas on that?
Yeah, I've wondered about that question myself, but I don't really have a response. You know, I'm a philosopher, not a scientist, and the area that I've done all my reading in is vision. You know, vision takes up a huge portion of the brain. It's the psychology and neuroscience of vision is so well studied compared to the other sciences. I mean, it's not like I haven't looked at anything, but my impression is that at least the senses that are strongly spatial, and that includes audition and haptic sensation, are the same in this regard. Whether smell and taste or interoception are the same, I just don't know. I mean, yeah, there are some, issues to just how perceptual those sensory modalities are, where, if you believe that perception requires constancies, for example, maybe they're not quite so perceptual, but gosh, I just don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. No, that's a fair point. I mean, like, yeah, we are visual, neuroscience is visual, so that's, but I like your point, like, do we really know if interoception is something like perception? That's a good question, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about it. I mean, yeah, it's possible. I certainly think that you're right, that the senses that are closer to emotion might have, the thing about emotion is, most people, I think that emotion itself has a strong cognitive component.
Sure.
There are all these experiments that suggest that you can interpret the same bodily state with one cognitive set versus another, and you get a completely different emotion. So it may be that emotions are just very saturated with cognition.
Yeah, maybe. Well, thank you very much. That's illuminating.
I forgot to say that Jonathan Scholl, who asked the first question, is a professor in philosophy, and Jan-Peter Kunzman, who asked the second question, is a neuroscientist turning into a philosopher. And now we have Maëlle Lemoine, who is a professor of philosophy of medicine.
So thank you for the talk. So my question is actually related to I had the same question actually as Jan Peter, so you have answered that one. And the second question I had, you just introduced it. It's about emotion. So one of the things exactly I was about to say that to some emotion is a part of cognition, and in the definition you gave, emotion is not included, which is fair, because to others emotion is a different thing. It's not something that is related to cognition. But you said, just as you said yourself, yeah, there are also strong arguments to include emotion as one form of cognition. So I was wondering if that does not have consequences on your argument, in the sense that if emotion is a form of cognition, there might be arguments that perception is actually cognitive through emotion. That is, it's using a sort of pathway that is more related to emotions. And I mean, if that is true, there might be also, of course, as you well know, there might be also neuronal correlates to that. That is the very famous dorsal ventral pathway distinctions. So that would be, that's my question. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I was really very concerned about that issue when I was writing my book. And I tried to respond to it, but maybe inadequately. But here's what I did. I looked at the issue of evaluative perception, which isn't quite the same. And I was expecting to find that, I believe in so-called high-level perception. I think we see causal influence. I think we see agency. We visually represent agency. So, I was prepared to find that we visually represent affective properties, something being good, something being horrible, something being disgusting. Especially disgusting, it just seems so overwhelming. And that sort of verges on an emotional. I just did not find any convincing evidence for evaluative perception. I was actually shocked. Everybody believes in it, but when you try to trace down the evidence for it, it just falls apart. So, it's like with that color thing I quoted, people are not distinguishing between post-perceptual effects and perceptual effects. So surprising to me, I have a little section of this on this in my book. I just didn't find the evidence there.
Okay, so what you mean by didn't find the evidence is obviously not that there are no studies, but do you think that the interpretation of the studies is disputable,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes. We have a strong intuitive sense that we perceive things as disgusting. But when you actually look at the evidence with regard to perception on this topic, it doesn't look like it actually is something that, it affects perception in the sense that you attend to a disgusting thing. But it looks like the judgment of disgust is a cognitive or an emotional overlay on perception.
Okay, so I see for that kind of experiments, but what about, for instance, experiments where the visual stimulus will be very, very brief, and you may have an emotional reaction, but you have no, for instance, report or possible by the subject of what has been seen, for instance. How would you interpret that?
Yeah. Well, one experiment that I looked at that okay, so maybe it isn't really relevant. Yeah, so look, maybe there are other experiments that I should have looked at yeah, some of the people who work on evaluative perception have realized that the evidence for extreme cases, or like a photograph of a horrible accident or something like that, that the evidence is weak. And they've turned to what they call microvalences. So you can the idea is this: if you have pictures of objects and you ask subjects, they show them some pictures, and you say, which objects would you keep if someone offered them to you, like a teapot, or and which ones would you give back if someone offered them to you? And then you can use that to code these things with valences, microvalences so-called, and give them a score for each subject. And then they've done experiments with microvalences. So, for example, if you see two objects as both positive, it should be easier to make a judgment that they're, for example, objects of the same kind. Just like if there were two red objects, you could see them, and it doesn't work out. It doesn't seem to, the experiments are sort of hard to interpret. So I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm open to the possibility, but I haven't yet seen convincing evidence.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
If somebody knows evidence, please send it to me.
I was thinking exactly that. The next question is from Fridolin Gross, who is a professor of philosophy.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. The first question is a curiosity. Just why does the forming expectations come later about colors compared, for example, with shapes or size? And then I have a slightly broader question, mainly due to my ignorance. Could you elaborate a little bit on the wider implication this finding or your claim has, that perception is non-conceptual? So in particular, the kind of broader implications for questions in philosophy of mind or epistemology. Thank you.
Okay. On the second, on the first point, why? God, I don't know. I could speculate about why, but I'm sure you could speculate just as well as I can. On the implications, yes. So I had a slide in the beginning. So the main implication, of course, is for the architecture of the mind. What capacities do we have? Where are there major league borders and where they're not? So I think it's very significant for the architecture of the mind. It suggests that cognition and perception, I mean, I think there's lots of arguments for that, and my book is an attempt to do that, are highly different faculties. And as I mentioned, I think that there is a big importance for epistemology. As I said, I think our leading models of how we justify perceptual beliefs involve either just endorsing a propositional conceptual perceptual state or inferring from it. So according to me, I mean, on my story, perceptions cannot be premises and inferences. You cannot infer from anything from a perception. You have to first conceptualize the perception. And interestingly, there's evidence that in conceptualizing the perception, you very often falsify it. I skipped that part of the talk, actually, but it's really extremely fascinating that the conceptualization of a percept for a purpose can involve falsifying the percept. So I think that's a very significant point from the point of view of epistemology.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
The next question is from Yota, who is a master student in philosophy.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And so during your talk, I had this feeling. So you were talking about how to distinguish the conceptual and the non-conceptual perception. And I feel like this was mainly done in seemingly neurotypical infants and adults. And my question is, how would actually this change if we looked at neurodivergent individuals?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know much about I don't really know enough to answer that question. I did mention one non-neurotypical subject, the guy with the stroke who had color agnosia. But in terms of like autism or other non-neurotypical, the things little I know is that their language for many things is delayed. But look, the basic things, I don't know the answer. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't know enough to say anything intelligent about it.
It's perfectly fine not to know, right? It's also a good lesson for all of us. The next question is from Darian, who is also a student a master student in philosophy.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. It was very good. And so my question has to do with, I guess, larger debates in the philosophy of mind. And so how do these studies that try to differentiate like cognition, and perception clarify the hard problem of consciousness? Or is it something you're not trying to answer or you think it can't be answered? I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, that's very clear. And I would love to. So for those who don't know, the hard problem of consciousness is this. Suppose we find the neural basis of a conscious state. Why is it the neural basis of that conscious state rather than some other conscious state or no conscious state at all? And, that's the hardest problem in in the study of consciousness. And I don't have even the beginnings of an answer to it, but my hope is that by solving the so-called easy problems of what the function of conscious states are, how they function, will lead to our getting an idea that will help us to solve the hard problem. One thing that I like to do, and this has been a feature of this talk, is you notice I didn't really talk about consciousness. I always talk about perception. So I think it is helpful to put consciousness to one side and just talk about, we can say a lot about perception without even bringing up the topic as to whether the perception is conscious or unconscious. So I think that's a useful technique. And in my book, I basically try to do that up until the last chapter, which is the chapter on consciousness. And I try to draw conclusions for how the discussion of, can be used to argue about theories of consciousness. Yeah, so that's my technique.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry for the, I was just adding in the chat the link to the table of contents to the book so that everyone can get a sense of the 13 chapters, I think. I have two very general questions. So maybe I'm going to ask one, and then I see that Jonathan has another question. So my first very general question is that many of us are interested in different biological phenomena across the tree of life. I was very interested in what you said about solitary wasp. Can you say a little bit more about cognition and perception in different organisms, maybe from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, can you just speculate a little bit more about that, where this difference is found, where it is meaningful, where it is not? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Gosh, I don't really have much to say that. I do know that the social insects are far more cognitively sophisticated than the solitary wasp. They show really strong elements of cognition. But as to exactly where the boundaries go, I mean, I found Godfrey Smith's work on this to be quite suggestive, but I don't have any real general knowledge about it.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan.
If you want to ask your other questions, Omar, if they're related or not, it's up to you.
It's not related and it's super general. So Jonathan, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, mine is also a general one as well, but I guess the question, another one that came up when I was just talking with the students earlier, I guess, was to see, and I mean, you hinted at these earlier on, but kind of digging into and kind of clarifying this architecture of the mind, as you were saying earlier on, do these issues, or how do these issues also clarify kind of medical conditions, if any? So are there kind of medical implications in a way for understanding or treating individuals based on kind of some of the distinctions that you're exploring?
Yeah, so we have these cases of brain damage where subjects are have very little in the way of responses. But that may be because their cognition is very damaged. They may have intact conscious perception and, even a rich conscious life, but that they can't report or tell us anything about. There's been these famous cases of so-called persistent vegetative state, where when they ask them to imagine a certain, like imagine counting the windows in your house, or imagine playing tennis, and then you get responses that are very like those of a normal subject, even when these patients cannot respond at all to anything in their environment. And some of these patients can answer questions using this. So, it raises the possibility that a lot of patients who are, categorized as, patients for whom they're going to pull the plug, might actually have a lot of conscious perceptual activity going on, even though they don't have much cognition.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Thanks.
Oh yeah, I see that as a question. So my very general question is that, one thing I really like in your work, Ned, and I think it's exactly the same for everyone here, is that you illustrate the fact that there is an incredible continuity between the kind of work you do, which is in fact pretty empirically informed, and a lot about the empirical stuff. There's a lot of continuity between people like you and theoretical cognitive scientist and theoretical neuroscientist. And as you certainly remember, Ned, that was our conversation a few months ago when I asked you many questions about that continuity. And I know this is a very general question, but I was thinking that, especially for the master's students, but not only, I think it would be very interesting to hear you about the question of whether there is something specific to philosophers doing that kind of work. If so, what is specific to philosophers? And if so, do you think we should teach more philosophy, for example, to the neuroscientist, to the cognitive scientist? Or do you think that it's not a matter of doing more philosophy, for example, more training in philosophy, but for example, more training in theoretical considerations or in thinking more conceptually? So again, a very general question, but where are the philosophers in this continuum? And should we care about teaching philosophy to neuroscientists and cognitive scientists?
Yeah, so I am firmly in favor of teaching philosophy to neuroscientists and psychologists. I'm involved in a number of projects with scientists, and my colleague David Chalmers and I are two of the 3 directors of a $3.3 million grant from the Templeton World Charities Foundation to test the first order versus higher order theories of consciousness. It's one of these so-called adversarial collaborations you may have heard of, where we got together a group to formulate experiments that would have some good chance of going one way rather than the other, and that we could get people to agree that their theory would be challenged by one result, if not another result. And the reason philosophers are involved in these is because a lot of the distinctions involved in these formulating these theories of consciousness are distinctions that were originally made by philosophers, or at least where philosophers are heavily involved in those distinctions. And the thing is, look, I think that the issues that I'm concerned with are theoretical issues in science that that combine philosophy and science. And scientists and philosophers are both working in much the same ways. I mean, I don't have the experimental knowledge to really do an experiment without help, so serious help. But I can be part of a team that does them, and I can contribute to this because I had all those years of philosophical training that help to get the concepts involved clear. And I think a lot of scientists, especially those studying consciousness, realize that philosophers can be really important on a team. I'm also on another grant from some other foundations that has 7 philosophers and 8 scientists studying volition. It's on free will, and the idea is to get the philosophers involved in helping to design the experiments. So there's this huge area. Your students may be interested in the fact that Duke University runs a summer school every summer. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. They run a summer school that has lectures by philosophers and lectures by scientists. And they have a mix of philosophers and scientists in the so-called students, who are often assistant professors. Everybody who's done that has felt it was really terrific. So there's a huge amount of collaboration between scientists and philosophers now, and it's really a great thing.
Very good, thank you. We have 4 minutes and 2 questions. Please, Azat. So Azat is a master's student in philosophy. Azat.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting talk. My question is going back from these broad questions to very technical problems of the studies. It seems that in this study on color and in, for example, in paper which was mentioned by Jonathan, all the studies are performed in a very simple situations where we can have only very simple events of perception and possibly cognition. And that is possible to delineate these different types of perception, cognitive and non-cognitive. And I'm interested if there are any perspectives on doing the same job of putting this border when studying some more complex events of perceptions involving pattern recognition, for example, and like in place, not just making inference that we see this in simple case, probably we will see the same in the complex case. Are there any possibilities to delineate, even if we have a lot of this mess up of multi-layered perceptions and cognitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So look, the way I see it, there are 2 issues here. One issue is high level versus low level perception. So low level perception is perception of colors, shapes, textures, etc. And that's what I mostly talked about today. High level perception is perception of causation, agency, faces, facial expressions, emotional expressions of faces. And the results I've talked about are mainly about low-level perception. But what I try to argue in the book is that high-level and low-level perception share an enormous amount of the underlying neural underpinnings, and are really very similar, and that results that apply to low-level perception probably apply to high-level perception too. But it's a much tougher case to make, and I'm not confident in it. A second issue is so-called ecological validity. Do these very restricted experimental situations show anything about perception in the real world? And it's a struggle, because you need very limited experimental paradigms in order to isolate anything. And there's always an issue of how well it applies in the real world.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
The final question is from Stephen, who is also a philosophy master student.
Hello, Professor Block. Thank you so much for your talk. So my question is fairly general and concerns method in answering some of these questions. And so earlier we discussed the relationship between, you have these three different views you laid out and discussing the relationship between concepts and perception. You had the dualist view, the view you endorsed, which was the sort of top-down influence of concepts, and then there's the first view where all our perception is already laden with concepts. And you laid out a series of experiments that purport to resolve this dispute. I'm wondering, another possible method, maybe a complementary method, would be to think through the kinds of evolutionary selective pressures that would be involved in forming the relationship between these faculties, and wondering how useful you think that is. For example, the principle of energy trade-offs between different systems, how useful those kinds of sort of more a priori ways of discriminating between these theories, and how useful that would be versus just the experiments that you laid out.
Yeah, so I don't consider that a priori. I mean, evolutionary biology is a science. I don't know any result using evolutionary reasoning that casts light on these issues, but that just may be my ignorance. So yeah, interesting question, but I guess again, it's a case where I just don't know.
I think it's time to clap again and thank again Ned Block for this great talk and also fantastic discussion. We talked more than 45 minutes. We know it's very tiring, so thank you so much for that, Ned. I put in the chat the next PhilInBioMed meeting. Our speaker is going to be Deborah Gordon, who is a biologist at Stanford University, a specialist of ants, social ants. So we'll see if we learn something about perception and cognition in these social animals. But anyway, thank you so much, Ned, for this wonderful talk and discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great questions.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Bye-bye.